Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the April meeting, regular meeting of the Fairfield Board of Finance. Would everyone please rise for a Pledge of Allegiance? I'm going to ask the Vice Chairman of the Board of Education, Ms. Pamela, to lead us in the pledge tonight. So,
I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. All right. Tonight we have a series of items on our agenda. It's kind of a, for lack of a better term, a cleanup night of items that we've already had in the past. The first item, item number one, is to approve the minutes of many meetings from February 8th through March 22nd, essentially our February regular meeting, our quarterly meeting, and then our budget hearings up to and including March 22nd. The second item I actually pulled from the agenda because it needed some additional work, and that is the presentation from the Purchasing Director on a review of the current policies and procedures for the Purchasing Authority and consider potential revisions. We'll be hearing that, Mr. Hill, at our June meeting, correct?
Tentatively, it would be at the regular meeting scheduled for June.
Okay, so we can mark that on our calendars. Thank you, Mr. Hiller. The third item is to hear, consider, and act upon a bond resolution appropriating $400,000 for certain capital improvement projects at Holland Hill, McKinley, and Tomlinson Middle Schools. We will actually take that item forth tonight to allow Mr. Kiley, who's the chairman of the TFC, to arrive. He's going to be a few minutes late this evening due to a prior commitment. You members of the board will recall that these were items that were held over from our discussions during the capital improvement portion of the budget process. The fourth item is to hear, consider, and act upon a bond resolution appropriating $450,000 for the replacement of a LAN support switches at various schools and Board of Education central offices. Again, an item we're revisiting from a prior period. And item number 5, to review and act upon a proposed Board of Finance capital purchase and bonding policy. This was tabled from a February meeting to a date certain of this evening. I'm going to ask Mr. Kiley, who's the author of that policy, to walk us through it. I think we've had numerous discussions on that. And then any other communications and any other business. And that's the state of play for tonight. Not that I don't like spending all my evenings with you individuals, but might I suggest, since we've spent more times with each other than with our spouses and significant others recently, that for some of these items that we've discussed ad nauseum, we try to limit our comments to any new information and new discussions as opposed to rehashing old positions, if that's okay with everybody, to speed us along this evening. With that, I'm going to turn to item number 1, which is the minutes. And we do have a footnote on this, and Mr. Hiller, if you would help me out. You all know Mrs. Ann Stamler, who comes to a great many of our meetings and is a member of the RTM, and she was kind enough to review the minutes and send a note to me and ask that we make some clarifications of some comments attributed to her in one of the meetings. So, Mr. Hiller, if you would help us with that. Ms. Stamler, please.
On the meeting of March 19th, which was the public budget hearing held at the Oldfield Senior Center, on the first page refers towards the bottom, Ann Stanler, and it should be Stamler, which is a typo as far as that's concerned. And
Which is probably an important one to adjust, right? Okay.
Secondly, I think that Mrs. Stamler, who's here this evening, you had some comments. Maybe you just want to clarify your statements.
Please, feel free.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, the name adjustment, a typo. I do many minutes, I understand, I forgive. The March 19th is a simple one, with my apologies to Dr. Title, but what is reflected in the minutes is that I said I supported the Board of Education budget. What in fact I said was neither support nor opposition, but I asked that the Board of Finance in the future find a way of clarifying what portion of the town budget is actually for education expenses. So I would request that that adjustment be made. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody have any questions, comments, concerns on that adjustment? Seeing none, yes, Mr. Tetreau.
Not specifically on the adjustment, Mr. Chair, but just a follow-up question.
Yep.
This is, the minutes for that one are marked draft. Is there,
Good point. Is there any reason those are marked draft for?
They were done.
Well, that's the best reason.
Garabo wasn't there. They obviously
No
all
wonder
are
why they're
draft.
wrong. No.
Technically, they're all in draft form until they're adopted by this
Right.
board. When we file the final ones, we will have that removed.
Okay, so it's just the fact that it was on there and not the other ones we should ignore.
And Mrs. Garavella is not held responsible.
There you go. Thank you. Any other questions, comments, concerns from board members? Okay, so those minutes, I'll say, stand before us as amended, okay? And any other questions, comments, concerns? If anybody have an issue with taking all these minutes at one time? Mr. Kiley?
Mr. Chairman, unfortunately, I do. Due to travel schedules, I was absent for 2 meetings, the February 8th and the March 19th Saturday meeting. So I will need to abstain for those 2 particular minutes.
Okay,
If we can work that vote into a group vote, great. If not, I would carve those out so I can abstain.
fair enough. So I will carve those 2 out. Are there any other questions, comments, concerns? All right, seeing none, can I have a motion to approve the minutes of February 15th, February 17th, March 1st, 3rd, 7th, 9th, 14th, 16th, and 22nd? So moved by Mr. Polito, seconded by Mr. Brown. All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? Those minutes are approved. Now, can I have a motion to approve the minutes for February 8th and February 19th? March 19th, thank you. Mr. Tetreau and Mr. Stone on those minutes. All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? Minutes pass with 1 abstention, Mr. Kiley. Thank you. That's item 1 on the agenda. See how quickly we can move?
Wow, record time.
All right. All right. We're going to skip item number 3, and we're going to proceed to item number 4. To hear, consider, and act upon a bond resolution appropriating $450,000 for the replacement of land support switches at various schools and the Board of Education central offices. The bond resolution is attached. Let's see if we can find it here in the package. Yep. Also is a memo from Mrs. Nancy Burns, and from the district, as well as the superintendent. Now, you all recall this item, just to refresh our memories. Within the operating budget of the Board of Education, which was presented to us, was $450,000 in technical spending to replace the switches at central office in several of the schools. The current switches had lasted, I believe, over 10 years, and this was a one-time replacement item. Under the recommendation and the views of Selectman Walsh, he proposed that this item be considered for bonding under our capital policy, and that this item be so removed from the operating budget of the Board of Education, subject to this bonding, and that such funds within the operating budget be put towards the hole in the internal service fund related to the medical costs for the education employees. We had requested at our last meeting, I believe, or one of our last meetings, from Mr. Brockfeld, I believe, who made the initial request, that the Board of Education follow up on this item, that they discuss it at their meeting, and that they approve and affirm to us that if, in fact, we did make this adjustment, that they would, in fact, take the $450,000 from their operating funds that we were going to leave, and they would apply those funds directly to the medical insurance coverage, thereby increasing the internal service fund. The total of this would be $450,000 here, as well as Mr. Hiller, I believe, a little over 1.1 million, that through actions of this board and the Board of Selectmen, we added to the internal service fund during the budget process itself. Is that correct? Okay. With that in mind, Dr. Tito, would you mind coming forward and telling us? And well, yes, please. Tell us what the, and please, anybody, Mrs. Iacono, if you want to come forward as well, and tell us what happened at the Board of Education so that we know.
We suggested, drafted a resolution for the board that basically said exactly what you just described. That if the town, because it's not just you, right? It's got to go through the whole process. So if at the end of the day, the town bonds $450,000 for these items, that the Board of Ed commits to making an additional contribution of $450,000 into the medical reserve fund in addition to what's already budgeted. That was the resolution, and it was passed, you're not going to believe this, unanimously.
You wouldn't happen to have a copy of that resolution with you this evening, do you?
I don't, but I can go get it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Are any questions for the Vice Chairwoman or Dr. Tittle? Mr. Brockfeld, please.
I'll just take it. The question can be in discussion, the item in general, while
Sure.
they're at the table. I guess one side thing that just came to my mind is you guys discussed the specifics of what we just talked about, but did you guys discuss what would happen if the RTM were to cut your budget further than what we have voted on here? In other words,
No, it wasn't, that this was, right, this was limited to this one issue.
And I understand, because I understand that's what
Right,
you were asking.
in fact, I mean, at the point this was being discussed, the cut figure was bandied about at about 1.6, and the budget cut ended up being $2,025,000 and change, and the board voted to do this anyway. So it wasn't contingent on any specific cut, it was contingent on the bonding of this item.
Correct. That is absolutely correct. It's just specific to the motion. If it does indeed get bonded, then we will indeed follow the resolution.
Right. So, you know where I'm going with this, Mr. Flynn. I guess my concern is, and it's really not fair to tell you the truth, but you're here, so, is that,
So he's going to take advantage of it.
yeah, well, when else can I do it?
Welcome to our world.
No, but if we don't control what the RTM does, and I'm not even trying to imagine what they may or may not choose to do, but they certainly could choose to make a further cut. So I guess what I'm saying is that you're making a, promise is the wrong word, a resolution to take the 450 and put it into the service fund.
Correct.
But if, let's say they cut you $250,000 additional at the RTM meeting, are you then going to turn around and take that 250 back, so to speak, in order to plug that hole?
I don't believe that we would. I mean, our resolution, as we voted on unanimously, was that if this item is bonded, then we will follow through on the resolution. There was no discussion or attachment or caveat that if we get cut further, we're not going to stick to this agreement. Would you agree with that?
I agree, that's what it says.
I mean,
I mean, the two are actually not, the two are actually not mutually exclusive of each other, so it's.
I think
you know,
if the
you could follow through with one and then do the other.
Actually, I think it is mutually
I-
exclusive based
right.
on what the resolution they said was.
I
They said if they bond it,
Right.
if we bond it, they will put the funds to the internal service fund, period, regardless of what happens with the rest of their
And
budget.
does that mean they couldn't turn around and suck out?
They would be going against their own resolution.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I don't know what else the board could have done. I mean.
Yeah, no, the truth is,
Right.
I started by saying it's actually not fair, because it wasn't
Right.
what you were asked to do.
mean-
I'm trying to,
Right, I mean, this was what you had asked us to do, so that's how we wrote the resolution, that's what we discussed, and that's what we voted on. If you had wanted something in there that said, in addition, in the event of XYZ, we could have had that discussion. But I can't speak for the board on this because we didn't have that particular discussion, but I'm pretty comfortable saying that we're going to stick to what the resolution said if it's followed through
and I
on.
appreciate that. I think, in hindsight, I think a better request, ironically, would have been to ask, in other words, they took 1.9 million in their budget. from the service fund, or it didn't contribute 1.9 million, right? So we're asking them to do 450 less than that. And that's not exactly what, in other words, we're asking them not to take 1.9, to underfund by 1.9. We're asking them to underfund by 1.
That isn't how we understood it.
Mr. Tetreau.
Please, yeah.
I think, first of all, thank you for clarifying. I think the Board of Ed has done exactly what we asked.
Yes.
So to be fair to them, we phrased it that way, you agreed to it, so thank you for doing that. I think from their standpoint, their budget's in place, it's in the budget book. Any line item funded, and forgive me, or not funded, is in the budget book. What they're saying is that in addition to what's in the budget book, if they don't have to pay for this switch out of operating costs, they will take that number from that line item and move it over to a line item that will go towards the internal service fund.
That's it.
That is
So
it, plain and
that's what we
simple.
asked you to do, that's what you're doing, that's the scope of that. So again, thank you for that.
You're welcome.
And I'd agree with that, by the way. I think I said several times here, this was not
I
related.
mean,
to
the only hypothetical that can mess this up is if it doesn't get bonded, then the deal's off, right?
Right.
Okay.
Which we all understand that, so.
We understand.
Yeah,
we're good.
So, again,
Okay.
thank you.
Any other questions, comments, concerns? Mr.
I
Hill?
would just comment and add to it, a couple weeks ago when Mr. Stafford was here as bond counsel,
Yep,
he also made the comment that the bond resolution cannot be contingent upon anything, so it just stands by itself.
yep,
And there's no, if this and then that
Right.
type of thing, that it's, bing. If this were to pass this body and the RTM, we're going to bond $450,000 to get the switches, period.
thank you. Yes, Mr. Kiley?
Just quickly, Mr. Chairman, I just want to say thank you for working with us and being part of our team and cooperating. Appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Thank you for the guidance.
Thank you. I'd also like to, before you guys walk away, because Ms. Burns is here, bring up the memo that was put together and forwarded to us, explaining what the switches are, their useful lives, how they fit into the whole matrix. This is new information that was presented to us after we last discussed this at this table, and I'd just like to know if any questions, comments on the memo. Mr. Tetreau?
Just one of those very technical questions. Is this one switch or multiple switches? Okay, thank you. Just want to make sure that was worded right.
Multiple was the answer for those of you recording this on TV.
Yes. Thank you. Any other questions, comments on the memo? Seeing none, let's go to the actual language of the bonding resolution. Mr. Hiller, there we see $450,000. We see that the term is 10 years, correct?
Correct, that's in paragraph 6 of the bond resolution.
Yep.
Other than that, it's pretty standard language. That's with all our normal bond resolutions.
Questions, comments, concerns on the bond resolution language itself? Seeing none, do I have a motion? Mr. Kiley? Do I have a second? Mr. Tetreau?
Motion to approve, I'm sorry.
Thanks. I didn't know what you were going to do there. Okay. All in favor of the bond resolution now before us for $450,000 for the switches for the Board of Education? Opposed? Abstentions? Motion carries 5-1? 6-1, sorry. Math is a second language for me. 6-1, so that passes and now moves on to the RTM. Okay. Thank you, everyone. That was item number 4 on the agenda. Seeing that Mr. Kelly is not yet here, and we would like to have him here as well. You're welcome to stay, Mr.
No,
Flatto.
I just thought you wanted to.
We haven't
discuss the
taken away
CIP
your
stuff.
chair yet.
I'm
You're
happy,
now-
and I'm happy to cover the CIP for the Board of Selectmen and
Yeah.
describe it to you with allies, any other comments he wants to make, by all means.
Yeah, we're told that he'll be here in about 10 minutes, so if we could wait for him and go through the bonding policy
Let's
itself.
move on to the.
When I spoke to Mr. Kelly late this afternoon, he indicated he had a previously scheduled Stratfield Building Committee, which of course he chairs, and which was starting at 7, and he was
Never know
going
how
to
those
depart
go.
there.
Well, he indicated, I think, that he was going to leave, so I just want to be respectful of the fact that he's going to run out on his own meeting to get over here. So I'd hate to take up this item without him here, given the efforts that he and his board went through. So before us now is a holdover item from February 8th to review and act upon the proposed Board of Finance capital purchasing and bonding policy, tabled from the regular February 8th meeting to a date certain of April 5th. Everyone will remember that this is an item we've reviewed the bonding policy several times over the past several years. I think we've adopted it once already. This was an update to an existing policy for clarifications for other town bodies as to how we viewed certain items. And Mr. Kiley took all of our input and put together the resolution that now stands before us. So with that, I'll turn the floor over to Mr. Kiley and ask him to walk us through it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The document that's before you is the draft we did back in January, which was basically my collaboration of all of my footnotes from a number of meetings, listening to your comments, and trying to get them into one document that made sense and captured all those thoughts, accurately. So we've all read through this a number of times, and I know it was before us in February briefly, and now it's back for a final consideration tonight. In short, without reading through the document line by line, because we've all been through it a number of times, the document was designed by this body to help us put clarity and guidelines around what we thought was bondable and what we thought was not, from both what types of items were to be bonded, for how long they might be bonded for, and to cover certain specific items that we have in some years bonded in the past, even though it was over short periods of time. Think items like technology, police cars, repairs and maintenance, and other things that could have been considered for bonding during other years. Specifically, paragraph 7, or item 7, speaks to technology, and I would direct everyone's attention to that. And I would, beyond that, I would direct everyone's attention to item 5, or section 5, which talks about a recommended list of years of bonding for items. Mr. Hiller and Mr. Flynn, I did rely on some accounting expertise around the table to come up with estimated useful lives of certain types of items, general buckets. If it was allowable hardware or software, kind of a caveat there, meaning it was part of a building project, it would be carved out, looked at over 3 years, equipment over 10 years, buildings over 20. And then I left a variable bucket in there because there are some items that are unique, either in the type of item they are, or they might have a warranty that is 7 years or 15 years. And in cases like that, you might want to bond over the useful, not necessarily the useful life, but the life of the warranty. So that's why I did put a variable bucket there that our finance office could consider for those types of items. Other than that, there was one language change that I forget who made the comment on it. Up in sentence number 1, I wrote in here, capital, open parens, non-recurring. And what I meant by non-recurring was more from a business sense, things that don't occur every year. I was not referring to the formerly known as the non-recurring capital part of our budget. So we might need to wordsmith that so that people aren't confused on that. My definition of non-recurring was generic, meaning you don't do it every year, versus what we used to call the capital projects, the non-recurring section of the budget. So that was the language, that was the one language, I think it was Mr. Bolito who might have noticed it, I'm not sure. So that's it, it's before you, we can wordsmith it. I've got my soft copy up if we want to change it.
Mr. Bolito? Thank you, Mr. Kiley. I appreciate all your hard work and effort in putting all our thoughts down. I think we probably, based upon some of our recent actions as well as our discussions, we might want to wordsmith it just a bit in a couple of areas to make sure we cover it. And Mr. Bolito, I want to turn it over to you because you had your hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, Mr. Kiley did an excellent job with this. I think this really does a good job of capturing the flavor of the board in terms of what we're trying to do going forward. I think it sets forth what our expectations are for everyone to know. Going through it, as far as the non-recurring in parentheses, I think that could be addressed quite honestly with a footnote rather than reworking the whole thing. I think non-recurring is a term of art, And I think to eliminate the confusion with the, the budget formerly known as non-recurring, we could just put a footnote as far as that goes.
To say this does not mean the budget formerly known as.
Exactly.
What would you propose the footnote be? if-
I would just say that the phrase non-recurring does not refer to the capital improvement projects formerly known as non-recurring capital, something to that effect.
Mr. Tetreau?
Help me.
Do we need a second for that before we discuss the amendment?
Well, I was just discussing it. I guess we need to move it, but there were a couple other items. I don't know if you wanted to take it one by one, or...
Well, let's, do you want to make that a motion?
Yeah, I'll make that a motion then, please. Thank you.
Okay, do I have a second? Seconded by Mr. Tetreau. All in favor of accepting the
Hold it,
adjustment?
hold it. We need to discuss that, I think.
Oh,
Mr.
I'm
Chair.
sorry, you're right,
Yeah.
thank you.
I was seconding it only so we
I'm
got it
just
on the
trying to be
table for
quick here.
discussion.
Any other
My
discussions,
question would-
comments on that?
Yeah, my question would go back to Mr. Kiley in terms of what Mr. Kiley put together, and again, I'll add my compliments to the rest of the board here in terms of what you put together. Was this meant, and it could quite conceivably, the way you wrote it, apply to be bonding guidelines? Historically, and I've got a copy of them here, we've had Fairfield policy on non-recurring capital expenses. The way you've written this with the different timeframes and everything else basically covers bonding, period. So we don't need, my thought was, were you talking about still having the capital improvement or non-recurring guidelines, and this is separate bonding guidelines, or just having this be our bonding guidelines and applies to anything we might bond, whether it's a CIP project or a capital project? And then we get away with not having to
I will speak
talk
for
about
my,
the formerly not known as
Yeah.
kind of wording.
yeah, he who shall not be named. I'll speak for myself. If you look at the title, the policy on bonding and capital purchasing, I think says it all. I think this is all
I
encompassing.
meant it to be both
Yeah.
when I drafted it. I meant it to cover both and potentially eliminate that former non-recurring policy or whatever we called it.
So as a process, we might not have to do the amendment that was just motioned, but also when
Well,
we,
were you referring to that policy, or were you just referring to the?
It was just to
former
eliminate,
budget?
it was just to address Mr. Kiley's point that we want to eliminate any confusion because there is that term of art that was used in prior
Yeah,
budget years. It's not to mean that this is not encompassing those other items, it's just to eliminate confusion. We could just strike it in its entirety, the non-recurring, and just say capital expenditures. I think that would cover it.
I'm fine with
I
that,
think-
too.
I was,
I was okay with the non-recurring in there. I don't think it necessarily causes that confusion. The, once we
I'm
get-
okay with striking it as well.
okay.
nomenclature.
Yeah.
But procedurally then,
I
what
can
we're going to
withdraw my
pass-
motion, and I could put a new motion forward to strike the words non-recurring from line 1, if that's the pleasure of the board.
If I can ask one more question, so at least I'll know what I think about that.
Go for it.
Just to be clear, what we're talking about is this new process, and Mr. Chair, per your point, it's bonding and capital purchasing.
Yep.
So the old policy we had then just goes away.
We will say that this supersedes it in our adoption.
This is the only document we have going forward,
Yep.
and that's fine. I just wanted to be clear on that.
That was the intent.
Then I'm back to however we want to word this, but this will be our full policy going forward.
Will
so.
you,
I agreed.
will you amend your motion to strike the words?
I will amend my motion and put a new motion forward to strike the words non-recurring in parentheses from line number 1 of this draft.
Do I have a second to that? Mr. Brockfeld, do I have any discussions on that? Seeing none, all in favor of striking the words non-recurring from item 1? Okay. Motion passes, I believe unanimously. Okay, the item as amended is now before us, and I believe, Mr. Bolito, you said you had a couple more comments.
Yes, on line number 3, this may just be strictly grammatical. The last phrase says, "and replacement of for obsolete assets." I'm assuming it's one or the other. It should be replacement of obsolete assets. Am I correct?
Which line item again, I'm
Where you,
sorry?
bud?
Line number 3, the last phrase, "and replacement of for obsolete assets or assets whose
you're
useful
right.
life." That's just grammatical, I'm assuming.
Okay, we have a typo in there. We have of and for next to each other.
Got it.
So it should be replacement of obsolete assets? which
Yeah,
would
I
mean-
think that's just a grammatical error. I don't think
Okay.
we need an amendment on that.
Okay, that's fine.
Great.
Everybody's okay?
Yep,
That's good.
done.
The only other thing I would bring up, and it may not need to even be in here, but are we contemplating any exceptions to this policy?
I think, You can put a line item number 8, that you can allow for exceptions upon a specific request of the board and board action, something like that. I think you can do that anyway, but.
I think because this is policy for the board, not an ordinance,
Right.
not a charter, that it's basically at the discretion of this board if we choose to make an exception for whatever the appropriate reason might be.
But since the intent of this is for it to be shared with other town bodies, you might want a message to them
Right.
that we're open to having discussions by putting something in there, saying that, just so that it's very clear.
That's an excellent point.
Yep.
Excellent point.
Mr. Stone?
I don't know if you need that, because you're saying on 5, the following list represents the recommended bonding. So if it's not, I mean, it's a policy, but it's not a set-in-stone policy. I mean, there can be exceptions.
It's a fair point, Mr. Stone. I'm reading that, though, that's very specific to the bonding period as opposed to whether something can be considered for bonding at all. And maybe that's a differentiation. I'll come back. Go ahead, Mr. Brockwell.
Just we're splitting hairs here.
Yeah.
And I'll add, again, thank you so much, Mr. Kiley, because we all do enough work as it is, and this is an additional piece of work, and it's excellent. I wouldn't add number 8.
Okay.
Personally. And I would just say the reason is that I think that, one, it goes without saying that this is subject to interpretation or to be followed or not followed at the board's discretion, one. And two is that, as you just said, Mr. Chairman, we're the Board of Finance. I think we're the people that are looked towards for this by definition, and we're giving our guidance to the other boards and other town bodies. And I think that it would be unnecessary to add in a clause. And by the way, you don't have to follow if you don't want, you know what I'm saying?
Well, it's got to come back before us anyway.
No, I
It wasn't-
understand, but I'm just saying, I think that it just, I guess my philosophy in general is less is more, and I think it's an unnecessary clause that says what is obvious. So I wouldn't vote one way or another because of it, but.
My only point is sometimes what's obvious to us isn't obvious
Yeah.
to others. You know, as evidenced by the fact that the Board of Education thought with the switch that they had to put something of that magnitude within their operating budget. And when Dr. Title came up here, he said, geez, I was told you don't bond technology. When it was arguable whether that was technology or infrastructure. To some. To others, it was not arguable, but it's just an example. Mr. Tetreau?
Yeah, I guess I come down the other side. I think because of the issues that have come up in the past and because we have new people coming through all the time, that which, and they're not going to sit down and review our talk tonight. I would tend that to put something that says if there's something that should be considered as an exception, we encourage you to discuss it with the board ahead of time to see if it might be, or to come and discuss it with the board. So some way that encourages, if you don't think it fits these guidelines, please come before us and do that.
Mr. Stone is shaking his head, does not like that. Okay. Mr. Tetreau, could you put your thoughts, could you take a couple minutes and draft something that you might be
I think
comfortable with? Or
Mr. Bolito already does, so.
I can throw something out there. I'll just throw it out there first, and then we can make a motion later, but the line that I had considered, not as a number 8, but in the introductory paragraph, after the last sentence of the introductory paragraph, putting, exceptions to this policy will be considered at the sole discretion of the Board of Finance, period. It's clear, unequivocal, doesn't leave a lot of wiggle room, but what it does do is it puts it in writing that exceptions are contemplated by this board, but they're at the board's sole discretion.
Well, and I think the other piece of that is it doesn't pretend that we have comprehended every single type of project that might come down the road.
Right.
That's all.
What I like about it. Mr. Hiller, you had a comment?
Yeah, in reference to, with Mr. Bolito's recent comment on the introductory part, I remind the board of the actions that were taken last, I believe, late summer on Sherman School, and where we came here for the initial cost with the architect. I believe this board passed it at $50,000 or something, or $100,000. I'm trying to think. At some point, it got to $50,000, whether it was here or at the RTM level. And what would happen, for example, if this board passed something at 100, and then the RTM cut it to a lesser amount? Does that void it because of this policy? If you follow what I'm saying there, that
So,
that you have to give, the RTM clearly has the right to lower an authorization passed by this board.
Mr. Chair,
Yeah,
just,
Mr. Tetreau.
are we going to finish discussing Mr. Bolito's amendment before we get into that? Because I had some questions on that point, too, but I was saving those for the appropriate time.
We can discuss that now in relation to Mr. Bolito's comments, because perhaps something will be spurred to adjust his comment. So go ahead.
Okay, then my question comes back to, the minimum mentioned here is 100,000, the current guideline is 50,000. Is that a conscious change in terms of doing that, and why are we trying to raise that, per se?
Does anybody have a recollection of the discussion around the table as of the time? Mr. Kiley had the notes.
Well, I had the notes, there were just notes from conversations around the board. I think Mr. Flatto even had mentioned a number of $100,000, and it certainly was just conversation in the flavor of the board that made me write down that number.
Okay, and I just wanted to be clear on
yeah.
how that got there.
Yeah.
I think then addressing Mr. Hiller's point, I would think it'd be very important that we basically look at what it's originally approved at and what gets passed through here. If we don't, then we're in essence passing the word down that two things happen. One, somebody tries to overspend to make sure they stay at the 100,000 as opposed to getting it for 90 or 80 or 50 per chance, if we find a new way to do that. And second, given our timing, and let's look at what we're doing here, if we didn't approve a CIP item tonight, or the RTM cut it back to less than 100,000 at the end of April, it wouldn't get in the budget for another year because the operating budget has already been passed.
Sure.
So from a timing standpoint, I think we have to set that guideline based on what we approve. And if, in fact, they can do it for less, then perhaps, I mean, that would be in the best interest of the town at that point, unless there's some way to get it back in the operating budget.
So do you have a proposal from you that rectifies your concern?
That the $100,000 guideline is based on what we approve here at the Board of Finance.
Okay.
And that, then the corollary there, it assumes that we're going to do our due diligence, which I believe we have been, to make sure that the numbers we get are reasonable and fair for the project going forward. But in fact,
Does anyone have a problem in raising the bonding guideline to 100,000? I think your comment stands whatever this number is, whether it's 50,000, whether it's 75, whether it's 100. Your concern, which I'd love you to put some thought to the words behind it, okay, that we could address in this document. Okay.
you want me to stop talking and start writing?
Yes, I want you to put something down that we can put in here, right? Does anybody have a concern with the 100,000?
No,
Mr. Brockfeld?
I think 100,000 is we're a growing town, a budget of $260-odd million or whatever, and I think 50 sounds too low and 100 sounds better. And I would just add, while Mike is thinking, that you could simply make a small amendment to the way line 4 is phrased in order to achieve what is an extremely excellent
got you.
point, that we're really talking here about bonding that's passed here for 100,000, not
By the Board of
not
Finance.
expended, because it
Got it.
could be expended lower, and we never would want to discourage that.
Got it.
But it probably wouldn't be a very hard change to line 4.
No, it's excellent.
Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you.
So there's two potential changes, line 4 in Mr. Bolito's language to the first paragraph about exceptions, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So
Following
I'm
that,
happy to type as soon
Yeah,
as you
Mr.
guys
Stone?
have words. Mr. I'm sorry.
That's right. I got a few others, but
He's in charge.
No, I'm just worried about the exception part, because we're setting a policy because we need a policy, and then we're saying, well, there's exceptions to it, and it doesn't look very strong that way. So,
I think what it tries to do, though, I hear your point, and I think there's validity there. I just don't want people doing silly things trying to interpret the policy as opposed to bringing it up for discussion. I think we get into trouble where we do something that discourages discussion. And I'm just trying to make sure that the communication flow happens, which is why I'm okay with a consider,
I know where you're going, and I
Yeah.
understand, but it's just, to me, we're trying to set some sort of policy, and then we're saying, if there's a problem, we can,
it's a fair point. It's a
we
fair
can
point.
change it. And, I mean, why have a policy if you're going to have exceptions?
Maybe
I mean,
Maybe the wording has to be changed a little bit so it doesn't sound like you're just going to willy-nilly do exceptions.
Yeah.
And Mr. Tetreau, I'm going to go to Mr. Flatto first. He had his hand up first.
okay, I got two small things, but just to address the point you're just discussing, I think I think it's important to have a clear policy, and I actually think not having exception language is probably the better way to go, because it's not, as Mr. Tetreau said, it's not a legally binding
Sure.
policy, so a board at their own risk, if they feel they want to come in with something, has that right. Similarly, the RTM has the right to, reject or reduce, but I think having a policy of this board carries a lot of weight, and I think it's worth defining it that way and not worrying about it. The analogy I was going to give you was similar to the policy about not authorizing bid waivers. But if the purchasing director felt there was an unusual situation, or the first selectman, we can come in and request a waiver, which might happen every couple of years. But the policy has been there, and so I think it works. And I do appreciate and commend member Kiley as well. Kevin, I had a little input session, and I appreciate his hearing my thoughts last month, and he did some great work on this. I have two small suggested wording items that kind of came to me from the time I saw the draft last month that I'll just mention.
Okay, can we, let's focus on these two, and then we'll go to
Okay.
yours two. Do either of your two relate specifically to the two on the table? Okay. So, Mr. Bolito, do you want to change, or?
Well, let me put it to you this way. I hear what Mr. Stone is saying, and I think there's a lot of validity to it. You don't want to have it be ambiguous, or to I think what it comes down to is, do you want this policy to be a carrot or a stick? Do you want to encourage bonding resolutions to come before us with very clear guidelines about how we want it done, but allowing for some flexibility in unique circumstances, or do you want it to be a stick where your purpose behind it is to discourage certain types of bonding resolutions from ever getting to our table and have it become part of the operating budget? So I think that philosophical bent is where we need to go with this. Do we want it to be an encouragement to bonding resolutions coming before us, or do we want to discourage certain types of resolutions from ever reaching our table? And I think depending on which philosophy we go with, you keep the language or you get rid of it.
Yes, well, actually, Mr. Stone, I got to go to Mr. Tetreau. He had his hand up first.
I think we have to look at who the audience is for this. To use the example of the purchasing waiver or bid waiver, there's only a couple people in town that have to be knowledgeable of that and understand what our intent is. When we're handing out bonding guidelines, there's a whole lot of people that are going to involve. They're volunteers like us. They're serving on boards for some duration of time, and there's a certain amount of turnover. So you want to make sure that this addresses things. And to me, the biggest thing, as we're finding out with smart boards, is technology changes. And there may be reasons when you want to bond things or don't, and that may change over time. So I think we'd want people to bring things to us before it's all set in concrete and they don't have any other options ahead of time. We've made it clear early on with projects, and I'm going to pick on the Board of Ed again with the windows at Ludlow, where we said, look, tell us what you need, let us worry about how you finance it. And I think that intent is hopefully down the road there's more communication along those lines and more talking back and forth. And again, I'm going to pick on Dr. Title because nobody has yet tonight. As you know, he has very nicely told us, as the new kid on the block, he thought we didn't bond technology at all, so he put in his operating budget. I, for one, looked at that and said, no, that could easily be a bonded item. And I think we want to encourage Dr. Title or anybody else who comes who's new to the process to say, hey, would you consider this or not? So I'd like to see some wording on the exception to encourage communication. I mean, one of the values we've talked about here is to get more dialogue between boards about what might be, so folks don't get locked in or things get limited before we get a chance to decide the best way to handle those for the town. That's all.
Mr. Stone?
I understand what you're saying, Mr. Tetreau, but to me, it's sort of a non-binding policy in a sense.
Yes.
And I sort of, I don't know, to me, when you say, oh, we're making an exception, it just weakens it. So that's what I'm having a problem with.
Before Mr. Baloo, I'm not an attorney and I don't even play one on TV, but I did try a little language smithing here that may or may not work. What I tried to say was the board recognizes that there may be unique circumstances or projects which require the board to consider items on a case-by-case basis, and we encourage dialogue on such items with other town bodies. No?
The real
No.
lawyer just said no.
Then get rid of the word exception there, real lawyer. Pull out the thesaurus and do it better.
Well, here's the thing, and it's a good try. I understand where you're going with it. Again, what it comes down to is, what is our purpose behind this? See, Mr. Stone said it's not a binding policy, and, from a legal standpoint, that's true, but I think, in a sense, it kind of is a binding policy, because we're trying to set forth guidelines about what we will and will not consider. So to me, that's a pretty strong statement. I think that if you have a strong statement, and you're trying to corral these types of expenditures into a set of guidelines, that you want to have an allowance for some flexibility. Because what we don't want to have happen is, we all kind of know the discussions that came about here and what brought this policy up. Looking forward 10 years from now, when you may have an entirely different board looking at this from a whole different perspective, you kind of want to leave the interpretation out of it, have the policy speak for itself, and allow for some flexibility within it. So that's kind of the way I'm looking at it.
I agree with you, but I definitely see Mr. Stone's point of saying, I don't like putting out a policy that says exceptions to this policy. So I'm trying to find a creative way that says we should talk about this on a case-by-case basis for very specific circumstances. That's what I'm trying to get to. Mr. Tetreau.
Yeah, again, I don't think it necessarily has to be that complicated. We don't get
Exactly.
that many exceptional projects a year. We're not doing 500 of these a year.
No.
We're doing, half a dozen bonding projects, most of which aren't issues. There are a couple of items within a project that may be an issue, and some of those we can cut out as we go through if they get up here too often. I think the process we're talking about is the largest amount of regulations I think that we have in one place are the Fairfield Town zoning laws. And we not only have a big book on those, it's pretty doggone specific.
exception.
There's a whole process called the Zoning Board of Appeals in case you have questions about those or think you don't fit. So I think the idea of having an escape valve to allow some discussion, and again, I think that the typical problem that confronts many laws, certainly that we get handed down from the state, is that they try and legislate everything and anticipate, like they understand all the issues that take place down here. I think that we ought to design a law that has some, not a law, but a policy that has some exception processing, if you will, because once a year we may have an exception, that's all. We're not making exceptions all the time, and I don't think this board has made that many exceptions.
Thank you. Mr. Bolito.
The specific example I'm thinking of is exactly what we just dealt with the switches.
Right.
If you have this policy without any escape valve, as Mr. Tetreau put it, basically the discussion we're having is it or is it not technology that can be bonded? If you have the escape valve, rather than, for lack of a better word, wasting time with that discussion, you can entertain it and judge it on its merits in terms of whether or not you're going to bond it, rather than having the nomenclature discussion, or is it not technology. That was an example of something that was kind of on the line. You could go either way with it. The policy, as it stands now, without that escape valve, you're having the discussion about nomenclature. Is it or is it not technology? You had the escape valve, you're judging it on the merits. So that's just the point that I would make. I'll try to draft something a little bit better without the word exceptions in it, so we can.
You might want to try this. No. Mr. Tetreau, have you been able to draft in the last 5 minutes the language
We
you
get
want to
paid for
add on
this,
the
right?
100,000?
Is this a test, Mr. Chair?
It is.
All right, then I
I
would,
hear you're up for
then I
another
propose.
job, so I'm testing you.
It's part of the interview
Well,
process.
and I suggest you're not applying for this job again to get it right next time? For those of you watching, that was all in jest. Item number 4, the minimum expenditure spending level for a proposed project to qualify for bonding is $100,000.
Do we have a second to that?
Second for discussion?
Second for discussion, Mr. Brockville.
I actually scribbled something myself, not to take anything from.
And you waited till now to tell us?
I did, yeah. Well, it was your,
Get used to it.
it was your assignment as given by the chairman. I just scribbled, which is not that far different, but I wrote the minimum expenditure spending level to be voted on by the Board of Finance is $100,000. Thought that was potentially a little more direct, but.
Okay. The difference is, the difference is including the Board of Finance.
Right, including the Board of Finance, and also because that allows for something to come before us.
Change
that
the
maybe was
RTM.
90, and for some reason, we thought it should be 110. I mean, the issue is that at the end of the day, after we've discussed it, it has to be 100,000 or more for us to vote on it for bonding consideration.
Mr. Tetreau, would you like to work his Board of Finance comments into your language?
Or I'll withdraw my motion. and we can-
Okay, Mr. Brockfeld's motion. Do you please make the motion?
Okay, I'll make a motion that line item 4, or line 4, be switched or changed to the minimum expenditure spending level to be voted on by the Board of Finance is $100,000.
Do we have a second to that? Mr. Tetreau. Any discussion further on that? Seeing none, all in favor of that change? Opposed? Abstentions, none?
Oh, I voted yes, sorry.
You voted yes?
Yes.
Okay.
So is that 7?
Since he was typing it into the document, I think he approved. Okay, now we're going to go to Mr.
I
Bolito.
just want to make sure I have it right, though.
Can you, who was the second on that? I'm sorry.
The second was Mr. Brown, I believe, wasn't it?
Can you just give me one more shot at it?
Mr. Tetra.
The minimum expenditure
Minimum
spending
expendi-
level,
I just really wanted to stick with close as you had it. The minimum expenditure spending level to be voted on by the Board of Finance is $100,000.
okay,
Okay.
got it. Thank you.
Mr. Bolito, do you have something else for us to
Yes,
consider?
I do, Mr. Chairman. I took some of the wording from your proposal and merged it with mine, and we came up with this. The Board of Finance, at its sole discretion, may consider unique circumstances when determining the eligibility of proposed capital expenditures under this policy.
Okay.
That would be new language under number 8, or?
I would put it in the
Up
the
top?
first paragraph, yeah.
Just amended, appended, I should say.
Yes.
Yeah.
Append it to the,
So moved.
okay.
One more time, a little slower?
Sure.
Just pass it down.
The Board of Finance,
Here.
you want to just write it? Can
Yeah.
you read my
Do
writing?
you have that, Deb?
No, I don't. I'm
I'm sorry, we're going to read it anyway.
Part, yeah.
My apologies, I thought she had it. Deb's slipping.
This is what happens when you do brilliant legal work at the table here. All right.
The Board of
The
Finance.
Board of Finance, at its sole discretion, may consider unique circumstances when determining the eligibility of proposed capital expenditures under this policy.
And that has been seconded by Mr. Tetreau. Do we have any questions, comments, concerns on this item?
That's an add into the opening paragraph.
That is the back end of the opening paragraph, and Mr. Kiley will forward you the updated document.
I need to move it formally, correct?
When
You
determining
did, I
did.
think, and he seconded it.
Okay, good.
Okay, so, questions, comments, concerns? Okay, all in favor of that amendment? Opposed? Abstentions? Motion carries. Okay, I think we have to go back to Mr. Flatto, who had a couple of items.
Do you want to, first? Did you have something first, if you wanted to?
Well, I'll have it first if I'm recognized first, otherwise I guess I'll have it second. Go right ahead.
I cut you off, sir, so I
Well,
go
mine
back
are
to...
hopefully really quick for you. Just a couple quick suggestions that are minor, and then one that's maybe perhaps take 2 minutes to discuss. One is in item number, the definition. I just lost my place. Item number 3. Because of the types of projects we have, I was wondering if you might want to consider, Kevin, adding the words "to be acquired or built by the town," because there's nowhere in here.
Acquired or built by the town?
Yeah, because just in terms of,
Yeah.
building a new school on existing land or whatever. And then the other language
Number
item.
3, capital expenditures may include capital assets to be acquired or built by the town.
Capital ma, yep.
And then the other is similar in the last part of that sentence, to just add two words, and replacement and/or renovation of. And I'm thinking just the word renovation because it kind of ties in with a lot of state aid reimbursement language. A lot of the projects are renovation projects. So it just might,
Replacement.
Or renovation.
I mean, it's not,
So that-
like you can't do it,
Got
but
it.
Yeah, so let me, taking Mr. Flatto's suggestions, and thank you, let me make a motion that we change item number 3 to read, capital expenditures may include capital assets to be acquired or built by the town, capital maintenance improvements, and repairs to town or school facilities, and replacement or renovation of obsolete assets or assets whose useful life has been extended.
I took the extra "and" out too, Tom.
Thank you. Any, do I have a second to that motion? Seconded by Mr. Tetreau. Questions, comments, concerns on that language? Mr. Polito?
The only thing I would say is I would put and/or renovation, because you can have a project that's a hybrid of both.
I will accept that amendment to my motion, and/or renovation. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Mr. Brockfeld?
I think, Mr. Kiley, you said it already, but just the "and" before repairs, you
Got it.
pulled that already?
Yep.
Okay, good.
So now, Tom, it reads repairs to town or school facilities, comma, and replacements, and/or renovation?
Correct.
Got it.
Okay. Any other questions, comments on this one? Seeing none, all in favor of that change? Opposed? Abstentions? That one carries as well. Thank you, Mr. Flatto.
My second of three is a question that I think you probably want to do.
We already gave you two.
I know, I just inserted a third, you noticed?
Time is up.
But these are good, these are good.
Literally.
I think you'll be appreciative. In terms of item number 2 and the timing, normally the only time of the year that we allow capital improvement projects to come forward are part of the kind of budget process once a year. Large projects such as a building, major building project, could be any time. So just the question is, do you want to differentiate and kind of almost require the under $1 million type projects to all come at once or not? So that's just a question to you. And then the third item is a question as well. It has to do in the technology area. There are, from time to time, large project software upgrades, such as our assessment system or Munis. And I just didn't know whether you wanted to have a possible item for those kind of unusual large upgrade types, even if they're technology related. So just throw those two questions at you.
Thank you. I had the same comment or thought on the technology side, where I think we need to discuss that just a little bit to provide clarification. I'm not sure of your first one. Let me think about that. Mr. Tetreau, you had a comment?
I think that part of the discussion by this board at different times, and as we tweaked it this year, has been to take the CIP out of the budget process, or strictly, let me rephrase that, strictly within the budget process in order to basically solve our workload problem, and that
right.
sometimes we need more time to discuss this. The budget can be a distraction to focusing on other items. So we talked about moving it at least a little bit to allow both the RTM and this board to have more time to discuss it. If perchance there were a number of issues that came up in November, I don't see any problem with taking them up then. Not that we plan to do that, but I don't know if I'd want a policy that says, no, we can't take them up then. With respect to the second point, I think the first selectman makes a very good point there, in that possibly something relating to upgrades, be they hardware or software. Again, it's kind of a non-recurring, it's once in a life cycle type of thing. It may be something for having a minimal impact on the tax rate that we choose to bond for that. So I think that upgrade consideration ought to be something we consider.
I agree completely with Mr. Tetreau. Mr. Polito?
As to the first item, I agree with Mr. Tetreau completely. I think we don't want to box ourselves in terms of when we hear these type of projects. We want to try to get it out of that March morass that we're in. As far as the upgrades in technology, I think we have that covered as far as that brilliantly drafted language we put in about unique circumstances. So I think it's kind of already covered.
I think we should be more specific on the technology, though. I do. I think we have to cover two things. We have to cover long-term, long-lived technology infrastructure, and we have to cover major software upgrade projects. I think those are two items that we need to cover. Yeah, Mr. Tetreau?
Just for discussion purposes, think Munis.
Right.
Where it is technology, it is software, yet it's an upgrade, and we wouldn't want to necessarily pay for that in the operating budget. That type of thing. It's not something we're doing every year, but that was the thought.
Go ahead, Mr. Polito.
I can certainly get my arms around that. The only thing is it needs to be drafted carefully, because upgrade is a very vague term when you're talking about technology. I know we have it's got to be over $100,000 and all the other, qualifications for it, but upgrade seems a little wishy-washy to me. There's got to be a more precise term, but not too precise so that we're boxing ourselves in again. I got to think about that one.
I'm trying to draft something here, but I can't really
I would
do
tend
it.
to- I would tend to agree with Mr. Bolito just said. Upgrade is a very, that's a word that worries me a little bit. That could allow a lot of things in that I don't think we would want in.
Not at $100,000 a pop.
I could think of a lot of software items or hardware items that could need $100,000 worth of upgrades that we still would consider. I mean, we could have a whole string of PCs that they wanted new hard drives, and every one of them, it could end up to be $100,000.
Not 100,000 each.
Not to my knowledge.
No, not each, but what happens if there was
You don't,
200 hard drives?
Well, no, they're also not software.
That would go through the budget based on item number 7.
Right. See, I think it's just large software implementations, and you can even put in parentheses, large software systems implementations, parentheses, enterprise-wide systems,
I have no problem with that.
right? As well as technology infrastructure items with long useful lives, to exceed X number of years, right, can be considered for bonding/capitalization.
No problem with that.
Okay,
In fact, if you just could repeat that exactly, that could become number.
right. I think, well, what I did is, I put, as I was trying to do it,
In number
let's
8?
see if I can get it. No, I put it as number 7.
Okay.
I put technology bonding. As a general rule, all technology spending must be expensed through annual budgets, with the exception of hardware and software directly associated with the expansion of current classroom space and/or town-owned property. Technology for replacement space or temporary space additions do not qualify for bonding and must be funded through the annual project budget for the appropriate town funding process. In the case where the bonding of technology is allowed in new space areas, technology expenditures will be separated from the building project and be bonded over, I would say, as opposed to 3 years, I would say over its useful life,
That would-
over a
that would
period not
cover
to
you.
exceed its useful life.
That would cover it.
Okay. Then I would put, the board will consider large software systems implementation projects. And an example, i.e. enterprise-wide systems, right, Munis, and technology infrastructure purchases with a useful life to exceed 7 years, okay, as a potential capital, a bonding/capital item. I would add that to the bottom. Do you have that?
Does he have that?
No, I'm up to the board. The Board of Finance will consider large
It's hard to do on the
system-wide
fly.
technology projects.
Right, exactly. Hello, chief.
Could you just start again from, I'll begin now?
The Board of Finance will consider large system-wide technology projects.
Large system-wide software implementation projects.
Okay, hold on.
You were this close.
Okay.
In parentheses, i.e. enterprise-wide software, and then in parentheses, or in parens, you can put Munis, not parens, but in quotations, you could put Munis, right? And specific technology infrastructure projects with useful lives of over 7 years, for bonding/capitalization. After that, may I please have a second to my motion?
I'll second.
Thank you, Mr. Bolito. You guys were having fun with me.
Does the close parentheses end after the of over 7 years?
No, the closed parentheses ends at the end of the sentence,
The whole thing, okay.
the end of where I talk about Munis. Because I only opened parens and then I closed after Munis,
Okay, thank you.
right?
Yep.
Yeah, Mr. Bolito?
I see what you're trying to do. The only problem is, if the purpose of this document is to eliminate, or to a certain extent eliminate interpretation, boy, that creates a whole lot of interpretation. I mean, I'm not sure what 50% of that really means in terms of actual examples. I get munis as an example, but I just think you're creating too much for future boards to interpret, to be quite blunt with you. That's why I think the catch-all of unique circumstances would, I know you disagree, but.
Yeah, because it's not unique. Doing an ERP system implementation, while rare, isn't unique. And you can foresee it being here, you know, every 3-4 years, a different type of system, not the same system, or else it wouldn't apply, but a different, you know, whether it's an ERP system, whether it's the tax system, whether it's an attendance system, whether it's a payroll system.
Is there a general?
Any number of software implementations are rare, but not unique or unforeseen or.
The problem that, again, I see what you're trying to do. I'm trying to come at it a different way. Is there, Nancy, is there some general catch-all technology phrase that would encompass everything Tom's trying to talk about? What the situation I'm envisioning is that 10 years from now, when we're all off the board, and maybe you have people on this board who are, you know, less technically savvy or finance savvy, are they going to know what we're talking about is kind of what I'm getting at.
Kevin's been here for like 30 years.
Assuming there's a few, you know, there'll be a couple of long tooths holding out. You know, I'm just trying to consider longevity with this, so we're not going to have to rewrite this in 5 years. Is there some catch-all phrase you can think of?
I would suggest systems implementations, because
Right.
systems covers everything.
Right.
And it doesn't matter whether it's software or hardware or something we can't even conceive of at this point.
And the reason I broke it out was because I didn't want someone debating what did systems implementations mean, which is the reason I had put systems implementation on one and hardware
Yeah, I think if
there.
you did an EG, that would, like you were saying
Yeah.
earlier, I think that would help.
Yeah,
So systems implementation, for example, munis, something to that effect.
exactly.
That works for me. I think it's specific enough so that you're not going to have these arguments about nomenclature.
So which part do you want to change? I think we need to leave technology infrastructure. We can strike software and put systems implementation.
And you can have IE munis.
That was already in there.
I thought it was enterprise, or was that another word for
And
munis?
it was both enterprise-wide and then in
It's
parentheses,
IE.
and then I put parentheses munis.
Okay, all right.
It's i.e. enterprise-wide software projects, comma, munis, close parens.
Yep.
That's what I have.
Mr. Kiley, could you just read that back
Sure.
the way we have it? Thanks.
Sure. The Board of Finance will consider large system-wide software implementation projects, open parens, i.e. enterprise-wide software projects, comma, munis, close parens, and software technology infrastructure projects with useful lives of over 7 years for bonding/capitalization.
You included one too
Did I-
many softwares. It should be,
And technology,
oh, it's not software, it's specific.
specific, got it.
Thank you.
Yep.
Why 7 years?
It's a lucky number, yeah.
Mickey Mantle's not.
Because I thought 5 years was too short and 10 years was too long.
Okay, fair enough. Just wanted to know where we get the number from.
Yeah.
All right.
Mickey Mantle. There was Mr. Belito.
So it's on the table for
Okay, so Mr. Kiley, if I might ask you, can you read line item number 7 in its
The whole
entirety?
paragraph?
Whole paragraph.
All right. Item 7, technology bonding. All technology spending must be expensed through annual budgets, with the exception of hardware and software directly associated with the expansion of current classroom space or town-owned property. Technology for replacement space or temporary space additions do not qualify for bonding and must be funded through the annual budget or the appropriate town funding process. In the case where the bonding of technology is allowed in new space areas, the technology expenditures will be separated from the building project and bonded over their useful life. The Board of Finance will consider large system-wide software implementation projects, i.e. enterprise-wide software projects and munis, and specific technology infrastructure projects with useful lives of over 7 years for bonding/capitalization.
I had it a little bit different. So, see if I had it. At the very end of the existing, at the very end of the existing Article number 7, it said the building project and bonded over a period not to exceed its useful life. not 3 years.
That's correct. That's what he read.
Is that what he read?
That is what he read. He changed it. Yeah. The only other item I had was at the very beginning where it says technology bonding. Just to set the whole thing up, I had inserted as a general rule, all technology spending.
I got it. I think we're good.
Does
Check
anyone
my-
have any questions, comments, concerns on the language? Seeing none, all in favor of that item number 7 as amended? All opposed? Abstentions? Okay, that motion carries, so that's now before us.
Oh, and just for the record, I did make Mr. Flato's 2 changes up top.
Yep.
They were mainly language changes.
Okay, Mr. Tetreau, one more?
In another, I'm going back to the current non-recurring capital policy, and there are 2 items there, given recent history, it seems we might want to consider including. Item 6 in the current policy reads, "Funding for capital non-recurring projects may only be expended for the purposes described within the budget and the appropriation resolutions." So I'd like to see something like that added in. Second is item 7 under the current non-recurring capital expense policy. Unspent funds shall be unencumbered and closed out within 3 years of such projects being completed under budget, or if a project is determined to be unnecessary or infeasible.
Mr. Tetreau, thank you. I would propose we add both those lines, and
Pass them over.
in my opinion, would put them as number 3 and number 4. And move the other items down.
Okay. So
that a second?
insert after
Huh?
2, a new item number
Is
3.
that a second, Mr. Chair?
That is a second. If you will take my recommendations to put it as number 3 and number 4 within the policy. Yeah. If you don't take it, I won't know.
Hey, come on, you're killing me here. 3 and 4.
At this point, Kevin Kiley feels like Thomas Jefferson, and he's,
That's right.
They got it right eventually, though.
exactly. Right, we have a Binghamton man at the computer.
Mr. Chair, did you want to vote on that before we put Mr. Kiley's fingers to?
Yes, I just wanted him to read it back to us, and then we'll vote on it. Because he can erase it if we don't like it. That's why it's 2 separate things.
You're saving that periodically, right? Good.
Mr. Kiley, any chance you can read it back to us?
Sure. Item number 3, inserted, funding for capital non-recurring projects may only be expended for the purpose described within the budget
And the appropriation resolution.
and appropriation resolutions.
Bond appropriation resolution.
And bond appropriation resolution.
Well, yeah. And bond appropriation
Resolution?
resolution. All right, let me read that back one last time, guys. Number 3, funding for capital non-recurring projects may only be expended for the purposes described within the budget and bond appropriation resolution. Good?
I think resolutions.
Resolution,
Single.
plural? Single?
Single.
I have a
Single.
single, okay.
And then the 4th one, Mr.
And then the
Kiley?
new number 4 will be, I haven't typed it yet.
Okay, well, let's just do it, and then we'll,
Unspent funds shall be unencumbered and closed out within 3 years of such projects being completed under budget, or if a project is determined to be unnecessary or infeasible.
okay.
Does that still make sense, 3 years, Mr. Hiller? I can do the typing. If you guys want to talk while I type, that's fine.
Yeah, how we
Yeah,
spell it?
it didn't sound right. It's infeasible.
How about not feasible?
Not feasible?
Dr. Tyler, can you help us out with that one?
Yeah.
Is infeasible a word?
Is infeasible.
Infeasible word, we were just talking about that.
Yes.
I think it might be unfeasible.
Is it
That's
on?
what we thought,
It just
too.
didn't sound right when I read it.
Or not feasible, I
How
agree.
how about not feasible?
Yeah, not feasible.
We'll have you note that the motion was made by Mr. Tetreau.
Actually, to be fair, I was reading from existing policy. So obviously, this board has been upgraded.
All right, you guys can debate the English, and I will type.
Any other questions, comments, concerns? Seeing none, I'd like to call for a vote on this motion. All in favor of adding 3 and 4? Opposed? Abstentions? Those motions carry, thank goodness, or Mr. Kiley would be very upset.
For what
Mr.
it's
Brockfeld.
worth, infeasible is a perfectly accurate and appropriate word.
And how many points in Scrabble?
I can't tell you that, but the Google, which is infallible, as well as
I was hoping, because I think that was in the first draft I wrote 10 years ago.
I was going to say, I think it's Ken's
Oh,
word.
so now he takes ownership.
infeasible.
Mr. Title, any rebuttal? Dr. Title?
I'm looking it up, it looks like either is appropriate.
An honest man. Okay, any other questions, comments, concerns on the policy before us? No. All right.
I'm going to type in read.
Seeing none, the policy before us stands as amended, and I'm not going to read the entire document.
I should probably read this last section,
Yes.
just to make sure I got it right. Almost there.
And you will email me a copy of that?
I'll email it to you right now.
Perfect.
I guess Mr. Kelly's not going to
Yeah,
make
but
it.
that's okay. I'm going to
It
make
said
it
8
so,
o'clock, right?
I'm going to make it so simple for you,
Okay.
there won't be
Okay.
any
All right, we now have a
questions.
new item 4. Unspent funds shall be unencumbered and closed out projects within 3 years of such projects being completed under budget, or if a project is determined to be unnecessary or not feasible.
Right. Okay, so the item as amended stands before us in its totality. Any questions, comments, concerns? Seeing none, all in favor of the board adopting that resolution?
Can you say effective May 1st, just so that it doesn't affect one of these? No, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
I didn't mean to interrupt, never mind.
Okay, all in favor?
Sorry.
Opposed, abstentions, that carries. And, you know, seriously, we had a bit of fun with it, which I enjoyed. But it's one of the most important documents that we put forth. And it is meant not just to be a policy that sits in a book, but guidance that goes to the other town bodies and helps facilitate better communication, a smoother budget process, and smoother meetings on our end. So I thank everyone for their hard work and their thoughtfulness that's gone into this over many meetings, many months. I thank Mr. Kiley for your authorship of the vast majority of the document and for the hard work and effort you put in.
You're very welcome.
And I thank everyone for their good humor in discussing the topic tonight. And we were filibustering for Mr. Kelly.
I just tried to reach Mr. Kelly without
That's all right.
success on his phone.
Seeing that, we're going to turn to item number 3 on the agenda, which was to hear, consider, and act upon a bond resolution appropriating $400,000 for certain capital improvement projects at Holland Hill, McKinley, and Tomlinson middle schools. Members will recall that these items were before us once before, or a couple of times before, and were sent to the TFC for additional review and work. They completed their work, presented their findings back to the Board of Selectmen, who approved it and passed these items on to us. Mr.
Thank you.
Flatto.
Might it be easiest just to go one at a time, or do you?
Please.
Okay. And they actually, believe it or not, I think they are going to turn out to be pretty simple in terms of your choice here. Holland Hill Elementary School is basically a simple project to remove a underground fuel tank that is required by state mandate, and to replace it with a system that operationally will be determined by the Board of Education, but there was a consensus that it would not be as large a tank as they originally thought would be a good idea. But the operational component of that is not part of the resolution because this is a funding request. But the Board of Selectmen did make our sense of the body, and I think the central administration agreed on the approach to probably go with about a 1,000-gallon, maybe a 500-gallon tank that would allow them to have the oil if and when needed for short periods of time. But for the foreseeable future, the amount of extra cost to fill a larger tank every 2 or 3 years when you have to rotate the oil in and out anyway would cost a lot more money than the differential between the size of the tank. If things change down the road, they could always put a bigger tank in. But the main cost is to remove the tank, to deal with any issues relating to that, to refill the area, and then to put in an above-ground smaller tank. And the estimate that TFC ended up recommending was $100,000.
Okay. Any questions on this item?
Just quickly,
Mr.
Ken, and I'm sorry, Mike, do you know? I was at the meeting, so I should remember this, but of the 100,000, you know approximately how much was added for cushion, for contingency?
I think it was about 10 to 20,000 was the unknown. There was about 40,000 for the removal. I think the refill and all that stuff was almost 20. And the tank is only, I think it's under $10,000, regardless of the size of the tank. So there was a fairly reasonable cushion in this for if, God forbid, there was some leakage, residue, stuff like that.
Okay. Any other questions, comments, concerns on this item? Mr. Brown, you all set? Okay. Go ahead, Mr. Flatto.
Okay, the second item is happens to be a $50,000 item, but I think it's a very important item. The Selectmen were unanimously recommending this to you, and this really was the item that you heard a lot about the slight, and it is slight. I don't want to give the public an impression it is major. There is slight leakage through certain specific spots in the parapet areas, primarily of the roofing system. The TFC reviewed this. I actually attended a 2-hour meeting. The 3 of the TFC members were out with one of the consultants the Board of Ed had hired. And the bottom line is there is not yet a definitive solution to this leakage. There are a number of possible causes. There are a few probable causes, but it is not specifically identified to be a complete unknown solution. And because there was more study to be done, and because regardless of whichever solution was going to be considered, the different types of approaches that they believe will address it once somebody finishes their testing and whatever they have to do, that all the various approaches would be within $50,000. Just to give you a sense, and maybe Mr. Cullen could take a minute on this one beyond me, but one part involves some strengthening of the openings at the top of the parapet and putting something in to prevent any infiltration above the parapet area wherever there may be some, what was the word, some caulking or some stuff that would go in there to create the barrier that's slightly open at the top of the parapet. The second issue has to do with if there's any leakage through the stones or through the
building envelope.
The building envelope that may be contributing to this. Whenever there's a heavy driven rain, apparently the experts are saying there's a potential of some leakage within the structure. The last quick thing I'll say, and then if Tom has anything he wants to add, is that what was interesting about this that they actually diagnosed was if it was major leakage from the top, the way it would normally drain wouldn't necessarily end up coming in where it is coming in. So that's why they couldn't identify it as formally coming from the top, even though, the district thinks that's the primary issue.
I think the understanding and the confusion on it is the cavity wall that runs the whole perimeter of the building is set up to take water if it has to. It runs down the cavity and then it comes out weep holes. The issue is they're trying to figure out why some of the water is getting into the building, which means it's crossing this cavity. At first they thought it might be where there's lintels. Lintels are structural members that are over windows and doors. So they're not real positive, and there was real confusion around that. So the money appropriated was to get someone like a Hoffman Architects who does building investigations in and look at that, and then there was a little bit of money left, seed money for any repairs that could be made.
I think the hope is the investigation would be at most another 10,000, and the repairs would be at most 30 or 40,000. I know it.
Actually, the other way around.
How big is an issue is it right now? How much water's getting in?
There's
What's
one
going on
We're
there?
looking at
particular
three
area.
areas.
There.
3 areas we're looking at where water's getting in.
And two of them are above. One's the second floor room and one's the library? Or
Correct.
those- Yeah, so two are literally related, because one's right above the other area.
Is it
and
doing significant amounts of damage?
Not really, because we're getting it cleaned up within 48 hours. The one we first found in the classroom actually rotted out the bottom of a file cabinet, a metal file cabinet. That's how we found it.
Really?
So that one we're on top of now and we're watching. The ones in the library we saw immediately because they're open areas. we
And
can
apparently
see it
it's the
coming.
heavier rains that, when there is some slight stuff, it's during the heavy type rains, not just a regular drizzle.
Any other, Mr. Stone?
It seems, I don't want to put a stop to this, but to me, this seems like a pure maintenance thing, not a bonding thing. And
I think I can, what the Selectman actually discussed that point, and very frankly, it is certainly not the normal type of capital item. I think our worry was, because of the lateness in the budget process, that we absolutely don't want to have any risk of not doing anything or having the district not doing anything. If they were able to say they could find that money in their next budget for this summer, that would be great, but we just wanted to play it safe, given the possibility that this could turn into, you know, an embarrassment for the school district. So I don't know how else to say it, but it's certainly not a capital replacement, so it's tricky.
Mr. Brown?
The original request was $400,000, correct? And then you received quotes for even more than that to get this thing fixed.
Actually, it went to the TFC.
Oh, that's what I mean,
but-
TFC received quotes from
But we had
Tetreau.
2 quotes because there were 2 approaches to fix it. The first one, initial approach, was just to provide a waterproofing sealant that would go over the top of the stones and the whole parapet, and eventually eliminate any water that could be seeping through the stones. But as we took the stones off and investigated further, our professional and consultant felt that there were some differences in how it was built, the parapet was built. And essentially, not to get into a lot of detail, but there's a lot going on inside the cavity of this wall. There's barriers for air, there's barriers for water, and they direct things. They felt, our consultant felt that some of those were done incorrectly or differently to the detail. But then the TFC got involved, and some professionals came out and looked at it again and felt that it could be more than just happening at the top of this parapet. There could be water coming through the face of the building envelope where the existing caulking and mortar joints are. They're now 8 years old. Some of those are crumbling and coming out. So there's more concern about how the water's getting in. And then once it gets into the cavity, why isn't it going straight down the wall like it should and out the weep holes? It's coming into the building in some areas. So I think the right thing to do is to get a building envelope restoration type company in, which would be a Hoffman Architects. That's all they do, is investigate building problems and see if they can help us nail it down and determine the fix, proper fix.
So I guess the follow-up question is $50,000 enough to do all that? Because, is this going to come back again?
It could come back. Hoffman Architects is usually somewhere in the 25 to 30,000 range to do a job of this magnitude. So that was the intent, and with an extra 10 or 20,000 to maybe come up with a repair that could be developed.
And I was going to say, personally, I would have been willing to consider $100,000 with an unknown for repair work or fix work, but the TFC felt that we weren't there yet, and they were reluctant to recommend a larger amount. But if the board felt, they could explain it to the RTM, with kind of large contingency for doing the work, that would be fine by me. But
Just one last question on the original contractor. Would this be considered contractor error? I know it's too late to go back to him. No?
no, the town attorney reviewed, and the answer is no.
I know we can't go back to him, but after reviewing what the problem is, is it in fact an error? Was it an error in the
Well, first of all,
contract?
the vendor that did it's out of business.
I know, that, besides all
Did that part of the work, so.
Was it, would this be, forget about the lawsuits and going back and the vendor being out of business, just the work itself? What's the cost? Is the contractor, would this have been considered because of what happened? What's happening now, is it because of the way it was originally structured?
Only if the consultant we hired who came up with the cost in the original find is found to be correct. I think once Hoffman Architect's done, if he finds exactly what the consultant we hired finds, then I would say it probably could be related to contractor error, but he may find something else
I mean, I will
I'd
tell
just be
you,
interested.
different than what.
Twig and I reached out to Tyson Kim, the architect. They don't believe it was a defect. They believe the work was done right. They said it was reviewed at the time of finish of construction. So,
Okay.
Mr. Polito?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I just want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly. Basically, the bulk of the money that we're appropriating for this specific part of this specific project is investigative in nature. It's not actual repairs, correct?
Correct.
Would it, from a procedural standpoint, would it be wiser to separate this one out and have a building committee, whether it be the TFC or whatever, look at this separately, have you seed money to do the investigative work, and then you could come back and roll it into a larger bond to encompass the repairs? Would it be, just from a procedural standpoint and clarity, better to separate this one out from the other two that you're trying to do? Because it is very different in nature.
I think the problem is, logistically, I mean, there's only one bond. I mean, I suppose you could amend it and make it a second bond resolution, 50,000, but that's such a de minimis amount.
But it's not just 50,000. That's what concerns me, is that the 50,000, the bulk of it is for investigative work
Right.
to determine what the cause of this is. I'm assuming at some point that you're going to come back to us asking for more money to do the actual repairs.
Nobody thinks it's a large amount of money, I can tell you that.
But until we determine the cause, we really don't know that, though, right?
Well, 5 people, I mean, you're right, there's no guarantee.
I'm somewhere where Mr. Polito is in terms of, I'm not so sure, given what you don't know, how much this is going to cost to fix. I mean, what was the original amount you came to us and said that it might cost?
It was 78 or?
It was 82 or 87,000 to take the stones off and do it correctly. I have it with me if you want it.
No. If it's that amount of money, I mean, we seem to be banging this around like, somewhat like a ping pong ball, right? I mean, the real answer here is you need, right now, $20,000 or so, $20,000 to $30,000, whatever that number is, to get some experts in here to help come up with what the issue is and what the resolution might be. I mean, is that a fair statement?
I mean, the only other approach might be, given that this is, a question in terms of bonding, is whether to allow us to come back and seek a contingency item.
Well, what I was going to say, Mr. Flatto, was, is there, number one, I want to be perfectly clear from my own perspective, I think the cause of this needs to be found.
Yeah.
Yeah,
All
we all
right,
agree.
there is no doubt, I think everybody agrees, water infiltration, we need to rectify this situation. What my question is, hello, Mr. Kelly, what my question is, or my concern is, should we be taking this amount out of contingency, right?
Yeah.
That's what contingency is there for situations like this. Using that money to figure out what the issue is, and then determining after we know what the issue is, what the appropriate course of action is, how much that action is going to cost, and whether that action should be bondable. It seems like right now, I have a hard time saying that this item should be bondable because I'm not sure what we're bonding. I'm not sure what the answer is. Mr. Tetreau?
Mr. Chair, I think you hit the nail on the head for me. I think that as I look at this, we're in essence talking about bonding architect's fees, which, if it's not part of a big project in and of itself, is something that typically we wouldn't consider. Not that
Right.
we couldn't make an exception, as we just discussed. Second is, I think back to the operational audit question from last year when we tried to figure out how to do those quicker. If the number really is, and let me say $30,000 in terms of the research money to find out what the problem is, then the question is, and we talked about teamwork earlier, is there a way for the town to come up with $15,000, possibly the Board of Ed to come up with $15,000 out of current year contingency, fiscal
Exactly.
11, to get this resolved? And then going into next year, is there some way when we know what the resolution is, then go back and determine whether that's, if it's 10 grand, maybe that's an operating issue. If it's 50 to 100 grand, maybe that's something we get into bonding as part of a CIP project then. But without knowing what the solution is, I'm in a quandary. And just the nature of this, it's $50,000 plus 10 grand of contingency within the 50, which makes it, 30 for one and 10 for the fix. If we're 10 for the fix, if we knew that was a fix, we wouldn't be bonding this. So I guess that if at this point in the year, we should know enough about where we stand, that we should be able to come up with 25 or 30 grand in the dollars we've talked about. I think what we've heard until now, and I guess we don't have our quarterly review till the end of the month, but I thought my recollection is we're coming in more than 50 grand to the good at the end of this year.
If I could just ask a point of information question to the fiscal officer. If, for argument's sake, the finance board wanted to do a transfer for contingency to X, that's just the transfer is just the Board of Finance, right? As opposed to an appropriation?
That would require RTM approval eventually to take it out of.
A transfer? No, just a transfer from the contingency account. to the-
Historically, we've always, anything that's come out of contingency has always gone
Okay.
through the
Okay,
RTM for
just
approval.
wanted to ask. I mean, I don't know if they could consider modifying to do that tonight, but certainly, given that we recommended an item and knew that it was, iffy, if the methodology was changeable tonight legally, I have no problem with it going to the board, to the RTM this month.
I think one question is, in answer to Mr. Tetreau's question, we're okay on contingency. There's dollars within that account, certainly if you wanted to move stuff out of there. Then it's really at the pleasure of this board as to how you fund this. I think there's obviously some reasonable consensus that we've got to find out, get to the root cause.
I don't think anybody doesn't want to do the right thing here in terms of spending the money and finding the item. It's just, in my estimation, not at the phase that we know it's a bondable item yet.
Mr. Chair?
Yeah.
If I could, just point of clarification. If we approve this as a bonded item, it goes to the RTM at the end of this month. When would the work start on this?
Normally with capital improvement projects, we wait till RTM approval, which is in May. It's usually like May 17th.
No, it would be, the RTM approval would be in April.
Next
April
question
20
is if they approve it in 2 weeks.
April 25th.
If we approve it, if the RTM
How
deals with
fast?
it at the end of April,
Correct.
when would we start the work?
I'd have to say, I mean, I
Early
can't write a
May.
PO unless I have the
Virtually
funding.
immediately.
I'm not
I'm just
trying to
saying,
beat
if
you,
the
I'm just
funding's
trying
there,
to ask what
how
the timing
soon-
is, assuming everything goes okay.
What do you
If
guys-
everything goes okay, I'd say we're doing it this summer.
Okay. So if we don't approve this tonight, if we come back at our April meeting at the end of this month and approve something, then it goes, or our May meeting, it goes on the RTM calendar for the end of May, could it still start this summer?
Certainly, the investigation could start right away.
Well, if,
Hopefully, my answer is, frankly, if they could figure it out, it shouldn't take more than a week to do.
Well, if they
This is
can't
not a
figure-
big project.
If they can't figure out, they won't ever start doing it, so that kind of,
can I,
They've only
is it
had
a
a
follow-up
year.
to Mr. Tetreau's?
well,
Are you done yet?
no.
Okay, go ahead.
Given that, I move that we strike this item from the bonding resolution and consider a separate item funded out of current year operating contingency to address this at our next meeting.
I was going to say, yeah, go ahead, Mr. Stone, you can second it. Can I ask a question on that, though? We're opening this up for discussion now, because I don't want to delay the investigation any longer. Would it be possible, and I'm asking procedurally, for us to take this out of the bonding resolution, actually make a motion to pull this from contingency and put it in the appropriate place within the current year's budget tonight, so that when the RTM gets this, they can review moving it to contingency, or because this hasn't been noticed?
At their April meeting. I
Exactly.
would say yes. I think you can, move it that way because you're determining the method of funding.
That's right.
In a sense.
That's right.
The Board of Selectmen has approved this under a particular method of funding.
Yeah.
And then I think what you're doing is you're just
I would say it's
modifying.
It's unusual, but I
their
would
method
think
of
it's-
funding it.
It's kosher.
Agree, Kevin?
I would agree. You know, we aren't, it's not a substantive change to the item before, it's, we're just changing the way we're financing it.
Correct.
Right.
And Mr. Tetreau, the reason for my motion, or my discussion point on this is I want to send a very clear message to the other board that we think this is a worthwhile effort that needs to happen. And we're not against making it happen as quick as possible, which is why I'm looking for a way to say, hey, we're not for bonding this at the present point in time, but we are for funding this, and we're recommending that we go ahead and fund this by pulling it out of contingency in the current year, because we think it's enough of a problem that needs to be addressed sooner rather than later.
And Mr. Chair, I agree entirely with what you said. I think that, and I would like to have it happen just the way you said. I do disagree, I think, Mr. Kiley, and from a standpoint, I think this is a substantive change. I think we're putting another resolution into this, saying that we're going to move money from contingency to something else, and that's a separate resolution and wasn't properly noticed at this meeting, so for us to take a vote on that, that is a bit of a glitch.
And that's what I don't, that's why I was asking the question, because I don't know the answer to that. I would like the answer to be what Mr. Hiller said and Mr. Kiley said, but I'm not sure.
And, Mr. Chair, I would like to be wrong more often, too, but it doesn't always work that way.
You'll have your chance.
Yes, what, your next meeting this month, do you have a meeting this month?
We have a
do.
quarterly
And we're
review.
meeting on
Oh,
on
not
the
till 20
27th,
So that's too late for the RTM.
Right.
which is the quarterly review meeting. However, that would preclude it getting to the RTM until the
Un-
May meeting.
Unless we jumped off our monthly meeting paradigm and held a special meeting to address this.
Your problem there is getting to the RTM unless, you see, the RTM committees are scheduled to meet next week, the 11th and 13th, due to the school holiday the following week. And the RTM meeting itself is 3 weeks from last night on the 25th.
Right, but we could vote on this tomorrow. As long as we get it to the committees in time, we're okay.
One maybe perhaps parliamentarian suggestion to address both your concerns. I know a board can add an item to an agenda with a two-thirds vote, and yes, that doesn't mean it was noticed properly, but this, in fact, the subject matter was properly noticed. So given that there was a discussion, it was known that you were talking about this roof issue, it would seem to me if you wish to, by two-thirds vote, add a motion for a different type of financial thing, you wouldn't be violating the spirit of the FOI, and you would still be following Robert's rules.
Yep. I think the first selectman makes a very good point. The only follow-on point might be for future reference. And I'd be in favor of following just what the first selectman laid out, is perhaps have the assistant town attorney look at that in the future and just advise us, so we know if that's an option, because I suspect this may come up from time to time in the future.
Great. Mr. Tetreau, with that being said, would you amend your own motion, please?
Yes.
Okay? State it.
Okay, from the top, I move that we remove this item, item number 2, from the bonding resolution and adjust the bonding amount from $400,000 to $350,000. And that, in fact, we then,
Let's do a separate motion on the next one, if you don't mind, because I think we need to have a two-thirds vote, right?
okay, we do for the next part, not for this part.
Right, so let's vote on this part, and then we'll have
Okay.
our vote.
Or then finish the third item, then go back.
Exactly. So that item is now before us. I'm seconding Mr. Tetreau's motion. Questions, comments, concerns on that item? Seeing none, all in favor?
You had one.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Mr. Polito.
Just,
I didn't see you raise your hand.
that's okay, just to make sure we got this right the first time. Do we need to redact this particular project from Exhibit A?
Yes.
Or is that just,
I think that's what
Was
my
that part of the motion?
That's what my motion was.
The
okay,
intent
I
of
just
Mr.
want to make sure
Tetreau's
that that was
motion.
specific.
And just to clarify, wherever it says $400,000 in this document, it should be
Right.
changed to $350,000.
Okay, that's fine, thank you.
Modified. That's fair.
Okay, is that it?
Yep.
Mr. Brockfeld?
Procedural question. Should we be discussing the Tomlinson work before we
No, we can adjust
we
this
can
on the
continue to
floor.
adjust it
This
afterwards?
is an amendment.
Okay, I'm sorry.
All in favor of amending this motion? Opposed? Abstentions? Okay, now, Mr. Brockfeld, your question comes into play. Should we wait till after we finish this and then go back and do the $50,000? And I think probably the answer to that is yes. So let's continue. Any other questions, comments on the McKinley project right now? It's been stricken from this.
Okay, the
Seeing
last
none?
item being suggested, recommended by the Board of Selectmen is to do the restoration of facade and cornice work at Tomlinson Middle School. The gist of this project, you heard last time, it basically involves door frames, it involves cornices going up to the top of the building, and some other facade work. There was, the TFC requested, and a study was done to see if there was lead in these materials, and of course, there is lead. So the estimate in total would include work to both do the restoration and fixing the corroded work, and to remove any lead-related materials from those structures.
Mr. Kelly, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I'm just, Tom must have gotten all the information, so as long as we have that, correct?
Yep.
Okay. Any other questions, comments, concerns on this item? Mr. Bolito?
Just so I'm clear, is there any current safety hazard if this work isn't done right now? If we delay this, there's nothing that's going to endanger students or teachers or anyone going in and out of the building?
As far as the rotting
As far as
material, or
anything
as far as
falling
it being
down on
lead?
them, as far as, it's just, the lead is the concern?
No, the lead isn't a concern unless you chip it, sand it,
All right.
try and remove it.
Okay, thank you.
I think well, maybe I'll, no, what I would say is, I think from our board's point of view, the worry was that the corrosion of some of the areas they're talking about could then lead to infiltration of water if it's not addressed soon. How soon, I have no idea, but that's the underlying concern.
Mr. Kelly, is that a concern shared by the TFC?
Yes. We're concerned that the work, the infiltration, if it continues, you'll get more rot, it'll just continue to decay.
Okay. Mr. Tetreau?
And Mr. Chair, having had a chance to actually take the tour with Mr. Cullen of the facility, there's a number of these areas where it's rot, and if we don't address it now, it will just become more rot. So it's fixing it now is the least expensive solution, as opposed to waiting and having to fix a larger piece in the future, even if nobody got hurt directly out of that. Okay. So I think that was one of the concerns in a number of the areas, like the columns and that type of thing
Good.
that were pointed out.
Any other questions, comments, concerns on this item by board
The only other
members?
thing I was going to say, my hope is it'll come in relatively below budget here, but given the unknowns, I think it's worth playing it safe. Just for the record, there was one other project last year that was funded at Tomlinson that they just awarded the bid, and it ended up being only half the $200,000 budget that was approved last year. So hopefully some of these things come in well under budget when the bids are done.
Thank you, Mr. Flatto. Seeing none, the item is now before us. The item is for $350,000 worth of bonding for projects at Holland Hill and Tomlinson Middle School. Do I have a motion to move that item? Mr. Tetreau, do I have a second? Mr. Brown? Okay. All in favor?
Thanks, Tom.
Opposed? Abstentions? That item carries with a vote of 6-1-0. Thank you. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 6. All right, Mr. Tetreau.
Now,
Mr. Tetreau.
the chair just has more fingers.
Yeah, exactly. If it went to 11, we got problems. Go ahead.
Mr. Chair, if I might, I'd like to move that we add an item to tonight's agenda, that we fund I'm not sure what exactly we call this, an exploratory project or a research project, or, Mr. Cullen, what would you suggest we call this? The research, exploration, discovery, what do we call what we're doing at McKinley?
It's actually a building envelope study.
Okay, thank you. That we fund a building envelope study out of contingency on the town side for, Mr. Cullen, again, would $30,000 cover what you'd plan to spend in this on the architect? Okay. For $30,000 out of current year contingency.
I'll second that motion to ask to add that to the agenda. Mr. Tetreau, would you entertain an amendment to that, though? I'd like to put the building envelope, what did you call it?
Study.
Building envelope study to find the water infiltration problem within the school. Would you second that?
That sounds fine with me.
Okay. So that is now before us for consideration to add to the agenda. I don't think we can discuss this. I think it takes a 2/3 vote to add it to the agenda. Okay? All in favor of adding it to the agenda? Opposed? Abstentions? That item is now before us as added to the agenda. Any questions, comments, concerns on this item? Mr. Brockville?
Mr. Chair, thank you. First of all, thank you to everyone here, Mr. Tetreau in particular, who came up with this idea, because I think it's a superior way to handle it. The only question I have is, excuse me, Mr. Tetreau, when you first mentioned this as a possible solution or strategy, you said that in the spirit of cooperation among different town bodies, you would ask whether or not that could be funded half from the town contingency and half from the Board of Ed's current year budget reserves or excess or whatever you want to call it. Would you like to speak to that at all, or why you excluded it?
Mr. Tetreau?
It's not within the authority of this board to require or, in essence, authorize spending by the Board of Ed. All we can do is spend from the money on the town side budget. If they were to offer to do that, that would be different.
Questions, comments, concerns from board members on this item? Okay, Mr. Tetreau, can you, yeah, Mr. Hiller?
Can I just clarify Mr. Tetro's motion, that this would really be a transfer out of contingency to the Board of Education, because they're going to be the people spending the funds?
Interesting.
Well, that doesn't necessarily have to be the case.
Well, I think in history would be, and I know Mr. Kiley a little bit, that when we've taken money, you got to, certainly there's funds within the town contingency account, and it's for items such as this that they would be intended. We've got to take it from, frankly, point A to point B. And the question really is the point B, logically in this case, would be the Board of Education.
Yeah. Then,
Go ahead.
and Mr. Chair, just as a follow-on point, perhaps we should just confirm with Dr. Title or Vice Chair Iacona if this would be acceptable to them, if that's how it works out.
You know, Mr. Stone?
It's $30,000. Suppose it costs like $20,000. Do we get the $10,000 back?
Well, it's a good question.
Well, operationally, no, except that, at the end of the day, on June 30th, if there's funds left in it, unless they were to encumber certain funds, and I would think that this type of study could be completed prior to June 30th, I think that, they'd, in what Mr. Tetreau referred to as a spirit of cooperation between departments, that
Well, let
if
me
they only spent 25.
Yeah, no, I understand.
Good enough for me.
Here's the thing.
But
I'm wondering if there's not any simpler way to do this, because there will be concerns raised at different levels over this. And my thought is, and I don't mean this in any disrespectful way, that the TFC has been involved with this from the start. And they've asked to, they've been involved with it since we brought them involved with it. And I think the TFC operates with the Department of Public Works. And a way to perhaps do this is to transfer the funds from the contingency account to the Department of Public Works for the TFC to use those funds, working with Mr. Cullen to engage the appropriate consultants on this item. That would be a very clean way to handle it for now.
It's a possibility, and it's obvious, again, it's the option of this board. I think, once, we haven't historically done that because the buildings are under the control of the Board of Education.
Understand.
For their maintenance.
We haven't historically asked the TFC to get involved at this level as well.
True.
And, Mr. Chair, if I might, one of the differences is this expenditure is not doing any work, but is actually doing an investigation.
Exactly.
So we're not doing anything to the building itself, so we're not impacting, or other than going on the grounds and testing a few things, I don't think we're doing anything in the building that wouldn't want done. So, again, with their permission, we should be able to do that.
Yep. Mr. Bolito?
As an alternate suggestion, trying to keep it clean, could we also not simply require as part of the motion that any funds not expended simply be rolled over into the repairs? So this way, the money would go to the Board of Ed, and as part of the motion, if there are any funds left that haven't been expended in the study part of it, that it would simply be rolled over into the repairs.
I don't know if that's not overreaching our authority over their expenditure.
It might be.
If we're basically putting the money into operating, it has been explained to me in the past that once we give the Board of Ed the money, it is then totally in their control to do with what they wish. So that
Mr. Stone?
I don't even know if we can do this, but can we say up to 30,000? Is that doable?
I
I
think
don't-
once
I
we
don't-
transfer it, it's transferred.
not an operating, it's
That's
not.
what I
it's not
thought. That's what I
bonding it.
said.
Yeah, it's not a bond or anything like that. And truthfully, my opinion, the quickest way to handle it and to have some amount of control from this board's level, and I do not mean any disrespect to the
No.
education side at all, would be to transfer it to DPW, put it with the TFC, and ask them to spend it on the study on this behalf, and then come back with Mr. Cullen and the Board of Education with what the alternatives to fix this problem are going forward. It's my own opinion. Mr. Kelly?
With
I
your
will
indulgence,
recognize
Mr.
you.
Chairman, you handled the Fairfield Ludlow window project as moving it into an account designated for that project, as well as the Fairfield Ward High School with a very similar application as to getting a consultant on board to help us determine what better costing on all those issues. Is this not a similar application to that?
I believe those items were bonded, though, because they were
No,
projects.
they
weren't
weren't.
they?
And in fact, Mr. Kelly brings up an interesting point, because really what we established within the
Thank you.
town side, and to be reviewed, because we said that we had up to a year under
So how
tax
do
laws.
how do we affect the transfers? Where did you put them?
Well, we can set up a separate account. We could,
Where, in DPW?
I'm sorry,
In DPW? In which department?
or under the control of the Town Facilities Commission. Set up a separate, we have set up two separate accounts.
Where does that show up in our budget book, though?
It doesn't show up in the print, it shows up, it would show up here on the munis sheets.
Okay, but which department does it roll up into on the news sheets? It's not a trick question.
That'd be a trick answer.
The Ludlow windows and the Ward roof are in the capital projects, have been transferred out into a capital projects account.
Okay, capital projects isn't bonded capital projects?
No, no,
Okay, all the other capital projects have a department assigned to them.
yes.
So which department were they under?
They're really in just capital projects, not specifically to a department. I mean, they're not,
Who tracks whether we spend all that money, and where is it
My
reported
department.
back to this board on how we did actual versus budget?
my department would be tracking that.
Right, and when is it reported back to this board, how we did actual versus budget?
It would, you know, in the two instances that Mr. Kelly refers to, the intent was also to come back to this board potentially in June, at the June meeting, to see if, you know, if there was further resolution on either of those projects, moving forward to a larger capital
All right.
project.
In our quarterly review, that's going to happen in a couple of weeks, on April 27th,
Right.
are we going to see a report on those accounts and what funds have been
We can,
expended?
yes,
We can.
you will.
Okay. Okay, are there any other accounts like that that aren't attached to departments that we don't regularly see how we're doing it?
Not that I could think of off the top of my head, but
See, I think it should be attached to a department. The departments that make sense are DPW, even if it's in specific capital lines. And then depending on what happens with those lines, they either go through as an expense for the department under the specific line item, or to your point.
we have the capability of setting something up and
Yeah.
just putting within DPW Operations Department,
Right.
just say, Town Facilities Commission study, or
Right.
something of that nature.
That,
And
I think that's the easiest way to do it for items like this where we're
with the
doing a
intent that
study.
it's,
Right, because I would think at some point, the auditors would like to know that they were, the expenses were properly authorized and controlled.
So the first thing I'd like to do is make sure that those accounts are set up under the DPW line so that they're within some department. And the second thing, Mr. Tetreau, would you like to amend your motion as to how you'd like to handle this, or no?
Yes, I would.
Okay. I'm waiting. I'm all ears. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yes. Forgetting for a moment how I originally worded it, or do we have the, can we read that back? Just like court TV, can you read that back?
Here's your moment in the sun, Deb. Don't blow
No pressure.
Move to add an item to the agenda to fund a building envelope study to find the building water infiltration problem at McKinley School from the Town Contingency Fund for $30,000.
To be moved to an account?
To be moved to an account within the Department of Public Works Operations Department for the TFC to work with the Board of Ed and Mr. Cullen to perform the study.
Sounds perfect to me. Deb, thank you.
You're welcome.
Mr. Chair, that is my motion.
Okay.
I'll second that.
That was an easy way out. Yeah. Could you repeat that, Mr. Tetreau?
Yes, I
Okay,
could.
that
Deb?
motion-
My turn. It's my turn to ask you guys.
That motion is now before us to move $30,000 from the town's contingency account.
Actually,
in
Mr.
the-
Chair, I think we're just putting it on the agenda at
I
this
thought
point.
we already did that by the two-thirds vote. So this,
We did that?
yeah, so this
Okay.
is actually, the motion now before us is to move $30,000 from the town contingency account in the current year budget to an account to be put into the Department of Public Works under Town Facilities Commission control to conduct a building envelope study at McKinley School to find a water infiltration issue that they currently have. All right, anybody have questions, comments, concerns on that item? Seeing none, I'll go to the public. Any questions, comments, concerns on that item? Seeing none, Mr. Kiley?
No, I was voting.
All in favor? Opposed? Abstentions? All right.
Move it along.
Moving along.
All night he's been late, now he's trying to get early. Trying to be
know,
on average,
exactly.
you're going to be on time.
You know, if you could type faster, we would have been done. All right, listen, there is one communication that I have that I wanted to bring before the body, and I know Mr. Hiller might have one other item. I received a phone call and an email from Police Chief McNamara last week after our budget vote, and he was very gracious to call, and he's very diligent in performing his duties. And he wanted to make sure that this board, by virtue of our reduction of his budget last week, was not trying to send some type of message, subtle or otherwise, that we were displeased with his and his team's, his management team's financial management of the police department. That mattered very much to him, that he understand the nature of our cuts. On our behalf, I told him I can only speak for myself, but I felt I had the sentiments of my board. I told him that that was not the case at all, and we were not sending any message other than the fact that we had a problem in our internal service fund, and we had to look high and low for as much funding as we could to rectify that problem. And in fact, I personally greatly appreciated the diligence to which he's put forth the financial management of his department along with his team. It meant a great deal to me that he reached out to me in the spirit that he did and took our action seriously. So, you know, publicly, I just wanted to state that there was no intent on this board, in my opinion, in any way, shape, or form towards the police department, other than the fact that we needed the funds and we needed to prioritize that need, and at the present time, that need was for the internal service fund. At this point, I'd like to open it up for other board members to comment, since I don't want to speak for everybody. Mr. Stone first.
I agree with what you said, and, as far as the police department goes, I think they're one of the departments that actually manages their budget really well. So I think what you said was very appropriate. But I understand where he was coming from, too, because
Yeah.
it was a large cut.
Thank you, Mr. Stone. Mr. Bolito?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since I was the one who made the motion to make those reductions, I just want to echo what you said as well. It's business, not personal. It certainly got nothing to do with any feelings toward how they're managing the department. They're doing a fine job, but we need to find some money to take care of a very big problem we had with the Internal Service Fund. And, we looked high and low and in many different departments to effectuate that. So I would agree with your sentiments.
Thank you. Mr. Tetreau?
And, Mr. Chair, I both agree with your sentiments and would suggest that if it would help reinforce your comments, that on our behalf, perhaps you send a letter or memo to the chief explaining just what you said here, and then you can speak for the board because we have discussed it here.
Thank you. And I did tell the chief that if he had any questions, if his commission had any questions, if he received any feedback from the public on this item, that he could feel free to engage me in those conversations as many times as he would want, and I would reiterate those same sentiments. Mr. Kiley?
Just quickly, thank you for your response. I completely agree, and it's the same outlook we had when we did a cut from, say, Public Works.
Right.
Another very well-run department, and we took 65,000 or so from that department from various lines, and in the spirit of cutting back and finding money to plug the hole. So, a very similar thing.
Thank you, Mr. Kiley. Mr. Brown?
I'm in complete agreement, and I'm glad that the chief did call you and didn't let this just stew with him, or if it was bothering him, that he got it off his chest and you were able to answer for him. So I appreciate his phone call to you as well.
So did I. Mr. Stone?
My only suggestion is when driving around town, slow down, though.
Touche, touche. The other item he did bring up was, in fact, we got into some of the specifics of the cut, and the one cut that concerned him the most, that I told him that he should feel free to come back to us on, is the cut for the heating, yeah, the gasoline and the fuel. And he said that he had used some estimates given to him on fuel prices by the town, and he used a similar gallon burn rate that he's had used, and that was the reason for, I think he had like a 30% increase in there, where we had approved something like a 10% increase. And I told him clearly that, come back to us if he ran into an issue, and we would be willing to discuss that with him, that, despite our views, sometimes we're not infallible, so that, we would be willing to consider and talk about those issues should it become a problem for him. And he greatly appreciated that. And I did appreciate him reaching out. So now you know what I know on that issue. Any other communications, Mr. Hiller?
Spoke to the chairman earlier today and said that I have received a draft contract from our auditors, Costin Rufkus and Company, for the audit to be completed for the year ending June 30th, 2011. It's basically the standard contract. The only thing that I wanted to modify in the contract is, as we have in the last couple of years, the fee would be, there would be a $5,000 fee as part of the fee that would be paid by the pension fund relating to the audit of the pension fund. And other than that, I think this, I believe, is the 5th year that we would be utilizing Costin Rufkus. We did, as you know, do an RFP initially, obviously, and then redid an RFP 2 years ago as far as services were concerned. And I haven't heard any negative comments within the past couple of years as far as that's concerned. And so I don't know if it's necessary for the audit committee to meet, but we are required under state statute, because this is solely the vote of this board, to bring this, and it would be an agenda item at the May meeting to appoint Costin Rufkus for that.
Mr. Hiller, I think it would be a fine idea for the audit committee to meet, to speak with you, to review the contract, and to report back to us on our May meeting, if that's the pleasure of the board.
Yes.
Okay. So if we could speak with Mrs. Leclerc.
I shall.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Mr. Tetreau?
Not on this item, Mr. Chair, but,
No, that's fine. We're done with that item.
okay. We passed some new bonding guidelines earlier tonight. We passed those to improve communication between us and the other boards. Looking at some of our past actions and our communication plan,
Yeah.
or lack thereof, can I ask that perhaps Mr. Hiller review with us at our May meeting what the communication plan is, so we make sure that these items get out to everybody that might be affected, specifically the RTM, Board of Ed for 2, any department heads that might be
And
impacted.
I'd also like the Board of Selectmen to get it as well.
Okay, and then, and I assume you're going to include the Board of Finance in that list also?
Perhaps. Yeah.
Yes,
Yes.
to our policy book, yes, please.
Yes, so we'll take care of that, Mr. Hiller.
I just wanted to remind you that, as we mentioned earlier, there is a quarterly review meeting scheduled for the 27th, and if you had any particular items, it would be a general review, but if there are anything specific that you wanted to have, or any particular consultancy or anything like that you might want to bring in. I know we've talked about bringing Mr. Perno in on the workers' comp issue.
Yep.
And
Let's work it this way. If there's any consultants or presentations at the board's pleasure, could you please email me directly, and I'll speak with Mr. Hiller about that. Mr. Tetreau, you had another item.
Mr. Chair, that I think Dr. Title had offered at one point to start including in our quarterly reviews some actual versus budget reporting from the Board of Ed, and I wasn't sure if this April meeting would be too soon for that, but through you, could we ask?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, we'll have a quarterly review with the Board of Ed next Tuesday night, which will be through March 31st, so we can forward that on to you right after their meeting, so you'd have it in plenty of time for your April meeting.
Thank you very much. I would appreciate that.
And we would distribute that with the call for the
Sure.
meeting on the 27th.
Mr. Brockfeld?
For Mr. Hiller or Mr. Flynn, the pension board, are they supposed to make a presentation to us at the quarterly review meetings?
We can, and we would be prepared to do that, I think. As I mentioned to Mr. Brockfeld and Mr. Tetreau earlier, the pension board is meeting this coming, the joint investment board is meeting this Thursday at 4:30, and are reviewing and likely adopting revised investment policy guidelines.
Can we ask them to come to our quarterly meeting and
Certainly.
tell us what those guidelines are?
Actually, Mr. Chair, if I might, it's my understanding of the new ordinance that was passed by the RTM that we're supposed to get a review at every quarterly review
Yep.
Yeah.
meeting
And
from the
I'm
pension
asking-
board.
I'm asking them to come. Yep.
Just to clarify,
Yeah.
I apologize, but Mr. Hiller, you were asking the pension board's current leadership. I mean, we love having Mr. Hiller give us his report from them,
Yep.
but we'd like to have their actual leadership.
That's
here.
correct.
Okay.
That would be the request. Thank you for the clarification there. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Seeing none, last item here, and consider act upon any other business. I don't know of any. Does anybody else? Seeing none, do I have a motion? Mr. Polito, do I have a second? Mr. Stone, all in favor? Opposed, abstention? We're done, everybody. Enjoy some much-deserved time away.